James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, it's a great honor to rise and speak on behalf of the people of Timmins James Bay, particularly today, a historic day when we are dealing with the need to reform the badly broken child welfare system and Bill C-92, an act respecting First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. And I'll say at the outset that we've waited a long time for this legislation. However, this legislation has to be done right, because Canada has not earned the trust to have the right to make decisions about Indigenous children. And if we are going to move forward, we need to see firm legislative commitments from government that they will live up to their obligations. Because we're talking about the lives of children, and I just want to begin by mentioning some of these children who've died in the last 2 years. Tammy Kiesh, taken from her home, where she was poor and Indigenous, by a state that said they would keep her safe, and she was found dead in the McIntyre Riverway in Thunder Bay. She was 14 years old. Chantel Fox, Kanina Sioux Turtle, Jolyn Winter, Jenna Roundsky, Azrea Cocopanense, Courtney Scott from Fort Albany, and Tina Fontaine. I have met the Cocopanense family in Grassy Narrows, a family that has been poisoned by the corporate crimes of Grassy Narrows, where 80% of the children are suffering from contamination and poison. And little Azrea was taken from her family to be made safe, and she was found dead on the streets of Kenora. Courtney Scott, who was taken from Fort Albany and died thousands of kilometers from home. I heard her younger sister speak, and what she told of the treatment of Indigenous children today in 2019 and the child welfare system will shock any Canadian. They have to understand that what happened in the abuse in the residential schools is going on today. And our nation has been very moved by the story of Chanie Wenjack. And we all thought how amazing it is, this moment of Canada coming together to hear the story of that little boy trying to get home to Martin Falls. But there's 165,000 children who are like Chanie Wenjack, who are trying to find their way home. And if we do one thing in this Parliament, is we are going to make sure that that legislation is done right. And we are not going to do what has been done year in, year out, decade after decade after decade, which is the nice words and the positive talk and all the oversight from the Auditor General and the Parliamentary Budget Officer and all the great committees that have looked into the abuse and the neglect of Indigenous children, and children are still dying to this day, and they're continuing to die. And we'll begin by talking about Tina Fontaine. And I urge my colleagues to read the report on how the system failed little Tina. Again, she was taken from her home by the white state, and they promised that they would keep her safe. And they put her up in a hotel and left her on the streets of Manitoba, and the Manitoba government doesn't even track the amount of children they leave in hotels. And in her final days, when she was listed as a missing person, she had contact with paramedics, police, child and welfare services, and not one of them came to her aid, even though it was known that she was being preyed upon by a 62-year-old meth addict. And when she tried to get help, they told her, ride your bike to a shelter. This was the state's obligation to protect this child. And she was found murdered in the Red River. And I always think of the powerful words of Sergeant O'Donovan, who found her body, and he said, if this was a litter of puppies, Canadians would be outraged. But it was just another little Indigenous girl. So this is what we're here today to talk about fixing. And there are many elements in this bill that I think are very reassuring in terms of talking about the language of Indigenous control of Indigenous communities. The rights of Indigenous families and communities to decide their own future of their own children has to be the beginning of the end of colonialism, because colonialism was constructed on the destruction of the Indian family. But unless we see the legislative elements that actually force the federal government to live up to its obligations, we will not be all that much further, because Canada as a nation is a nation that has used great and beautiful words for a long, long, long time, and they've failed Indigenous children. They have simply not earned the right to be trusted on this. So this bill today comes to us after 5 non-compliance orders of the Human Rights Tribunal that has forced this government into compliance with its legal obligations. The previous government had spent $6 million nearly fighting Cindy Blackstock. Michael Wernick, who's now retired, who was the deputy minister, who was involved in spying on Cindy Blackstock because they saw a woman who was speaking up for children as a threat against the government of Canada. But it doesn't start today. And it doesn't start with this government or the previous government or the government before that. It goes all the way back to the decision that was made in the taking of the land and the breaking of the treaties, and the fundamental principle, which was to take the Indian children away from their families and to destroy who they were as a people, which meets one of the key international tests of genocide. And Duncan Campbell Scott did not invent the residential school system, but he certainly perfected it. And when he was faced with the appalling deaths of children in the residential schools from the chronic, systemic, deliberate underfunding by the federal government, he said, "It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared toward a final solution of the Indian problem." The term final solution was a homemade Canadian concept, and it was based on the destruction of the Indian people. So why do we have to talk about history? You know, it's one thing I've learned as a white guy. You know, I'm always like, why are we always talking about what happened back then? If you cannot go into any of the Indigenous communities without knowing how we got here. If you don't know how we got here, you don't know how we're going to go forward. And it was the residential schools. And by the 1950s, the federal government had realized the residential schools had been an abject failure, not for the abuse and the torture and the rape of the children, not for the horrific low results of education. They decided it was a failure because it failed in its fundamental job to assimilate. And so they decided to use the child welfare system. So there's nothing accidental about the 60s scoop. The 60s scoop was a deliberate federal policy to take children, to take them as far away from their identity and basically turn them into white children. And the department's Children's Aid Society, and I want, if you read the book on residential schools by James Malloy, he talks about how, quote, fostering was seen as the most effective method of breaking through the welfare bottleneck and ultimately in tandem integration of closing the residential schools. And also had the added allure of financial reward, because children in foster homes could be cared for less expensively, since the maintenance costs on average are less than that for residential school placement. This was always the principle. It was about the destruction of identity while saving the taxpayers' money. That is the fundamental principle that has led to the chronic underfunding of Indigenous schools. It is the principle that has led to so much suffering and suicide in my own region, where we had over 600 suicide deaths, almost entirely of youth since the 1980s. And government in, government out makes all kinds of promises, but nothing changes. And so this was the fundamental principle that Cindy Blackstock started to fight over 12 years ago with the federal government, that there wasn't anything accidental about what was happening in the child welfare system. It was a deliberate federal government policy of chronic underfunding up to 40%. And so at a certain point in the 70s and 80s, they began to talk about Indigenous control of child welfare, but they were only allowed to control a broken, underfunded system. And it was ironic that one of the only times the Department of Indian Affairs will agree to spend more money on children is when they're being taken from their families. That has been the policy. The 60s scoop has been called the millennial scoop. It's the 2018 and the 2019 scoop. There are more children in the control of the state now than there were at the height of the residential schools. The policies are still there. So when I see Bill C-92 and I hear talk about how we are going to move towards Indigenous control and the Indigenous rights to develop their own family structures that are protected, where children are put into safety and culturally appropriate environments, I feel that that is a great moment. But if we do not see the legal statutory obligation of the federal government to close the funding gap, it is just to carry on. It was the ruling that the federal government was found guilty of systemic human rights abuse against Indigenous children in 2016 that was a landmark moment. And I was very proud when then the Prime Minister said that the government wouldn't fight that ruling. But he did fight that ruling. He fought that ruling to the point of $1 million. He fought it through 5 non-compliance orders, and each time the Human Rights Tribunal found that the federal government was choosing their own financial interests over the interests of children. And the 3rd non-compliance order of the tribunal found, quote, the definition of Jordan's principle adopted by Canada was a, quote, calculated, analyzed and informed policy choice based on financial impacts and potential risks, rather than on the needs or the best interests of First Nations children, which Jordan's principle is meant to protect and should be the goal of Canada's programming. And they found in that 3rd non-compliance order Canada culpable in the deaths of Jenna Round Sky and Chantal Fox and Jolene Winter, because they knew that these children in Wapakika were at risk because there was a suicide cluster, and the government opted not to help those children because they said that the funding request came at an awkward time, that they insisted that the lives of these children had to fit within the priorities of the Department of Indian Affairs, not that the Department of Indian Affairs is obligated to these children. And so the Human Rights Tribunal found the government culpable in the deaths of these children. These children were beautiful young children, and they were loved. And the failure of the government to respond in Wapakika kicked off a horrific suicide crisis that we are still picking up the pieces. And I was just in Thunder Bay with my good friend Saul Mamakwa, and we met with a family of a young suicide victim. And how do you talk to a family in a community that has lost so many children? And that child was taken from her family by the policies of this state and this government because they will not fund high schools in her community. So she was living in a boarding house at age 14 in Thunder Bay. So these are the ongoing deaths and sufferings and abuse from the underfunding. And in the 4th Human Rights Tribunal ruling, they found Canada's continued reliance on the incremental approach to equality fosters the same discrimination that spurred the initial complaint. And we know that when Parliament ordered the government, this government, to end the shortfall in child welfare of $158 million, the government came back and said if they were forced to spend that money, it would be like throwing confetti around. The government had been found guilty of systemic underfunding, but they felt if they were forced to end systemic underfunding that it would be a waste of money. And they tell us that incremental change is the path forward and that things take time. You know, I think of Dr. Martin Luther King's incredible statement from a Birmingham jail that how do you tell people who've been denied rights for 100 and some years that to wait? The change will come one day. The change has to come today. So, quite simply, we have to start from the principle that Canada has not earned, and Canada has never had, the credibility or the right to be trusted with the lives of Indigenous children. And if the government comes forward in a recognition of its culpability, a recognition of humility, a recognition that we begin the transformation of our fundamental relationship by saying that the future lies with the children, that the rights of the children will be protected, that the basic family units and the cultural units of Indigenous communities will no longer be targeted and undermined and destroyed through the chronic systems of the broken child welfare system and the broken education system and the failed housing and the mold crisis, that the lives of children will become the most valuable thing that we cherish in this country. We will be the nation we were meant to be. So when I look at this legislation, I see good language. But we need to have it written into law. That the Jordan's principle has to be written into law, because it was the government's continual interpretation of Jordan's principle that was found discriminatory. That the statutory obligations to equity have to be written into law, because you cannot trust the government. When I hear the Indigenous Services Minister say, well, we'll sign these agreements, you know, band by band, nation by nation, community by community, trust us. There is no reason to trust. And I respect the new Indigenous Service Ministers, but you know, Mr. Speaker, over my many years here, I've met good Indian Affairs Ministers. I've seen bad Indian Affairs Ministers. I've seen lazy Indian Affairs Ministers. I've seen racist Indian Affairs Ministers. The only thing I ever saw change in those 15 years is the concerted, unrelenting legal pressure to force the department to live up to its obligations. So whether you have a good Indian Affairs Minister or a bad one or an indifferent one doesn't make a difference. These are the legislative responsibilities. So what is it that we want out of this? Well, we want to have clear, written into law, the obligations of the federal government to recognize the jurisdiction of Indigenous nations and organizations, and we support that. We want it written into law that they will respect and clarify what are the best interests of the child, so that it isn't vague. That we will have strong national standards for ensuring equitable treatment with equitable funding, because without equitable funding, we cannot move forward. We want accountability measures for Canada that hold them to account, because you can look at what's happened in Manitoba with the Tina Fontaine ruling, and the Conservative government says, well, yeah, the Tina Fontaine tragedy, there's no lessons to be learned. I say that is a travesty when so many children are on the streets of Winnipeg because of the broken system in Manitoba. Or in Ontario, where the Doug Ford government cancelled the Child Advocate's Office, the one voice for the most marginalized children, speaking up for children who have been sexually abused, physically abused, children who have died in the system. If we don't have those mechanisms to protect children, the system will continue to destroy lives, and we will continue to see the loss of children. So, Mr. Speaker, we want to work with this government. We want to do whatever it takes to move this legislation forward, but we will not go along with just more words. Not after the deaths of so many, not after the Human Rights Tribunal, not after the work of young Cree leaders like Shannon Kustashian, who called out government for their systemic failure to the children. We have to put the lives and the rights of children as a top priority. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, it's going to cost. It's going to cost a lot of money to meet those 150 years of broken promises. But I can tell you there's not a single greater investment that you can make in this nation than in the lives of the Indigenous children who are on the reserves and on the streets and in the communities across our country. A young generation who are not sitting back, a young generation who are not going to be told what to do, a young generation that understands that hope is made real when they're given the opportunities to make change. That's when reconciliation will be made real. And without that commitment to the federal government, we're just continuing the long broken pattern. So I call on my colleagues in the government, we will do whatever it takes on our side to move this legislation through. But this legislation has to work for the interests of children, because Canada has not earned the trust to be trusted on the rights and the lives of Indigenous children. Thank you.